Okay.
All right. My name is Sally Powers-Albertz, and I've done other programs here, as some of you probably know. But welcome to Murder and Mayhem in 1800s Fountain City. First thing I'm going to do is apologize if I happen to mention one of your family members. Of course, these news items are 100 years old, and there's only one that I will not give the name for. And I apologize for some of the very frank language that they used in the 1800s in the newspaper. But that's enough of the apologizing. This program will give you a peek into the lives of our pioneers in Fond du Lac. Fountain City, you'll find explanation regarding how Fond du Lac became known as Fountain City in the handout. We had springs and good wells all over Fond du Lac. On the corner of Mar and 6th was the largest of the fountains, and it was 6 feet high, usually, but that dried up a number of years ago, of course. You'll find in that handout an 1836 map of Fond du Lac, and that was the way they wanted it to be. That is not the way it turned out. They thought each block should have its own little center park, but it didn't quite happen that way. What's on the screen right now is probably one of my most favorite paintings. It's by Edward Mascraft. He was a protege of Harrison, who was one of our foremost painters. Harrison's, a lot of his paintings, I should say, are out at the Galway House in the museum. Mascraft was just as good, if not better. He took care of him in his later years, and Mr. Harrison gave him his house and all of his worldly goods at that time. This is Fond du Lac. Fond du Lac is in the background with the smokestacks. You can see with the smoke coming out. And I'm assuming that the road that the stagecoach is coming up is the one that goes through Pebbles and then meanders kitty corner up the side of the ledge. Okay, the 1830s and 40s. I'm going to give you some basic facts to give you a snapshot of Fond du Lac in the 1800s. The first mail was carried on foot from Chicago to Green Bay once a month by Alex Claremont. It came to Fond du Lac from Green Bay sporadically, whenever possible. Alex's half-brother, who was Fizet Bodine, later brought mail from Green Bay to Fond du Lac once a week, again on foot. It took 3 days, one way. In various explanations of these two men, they are always listed as half-breeds. They were either part Indian and part white, or part Indian and part black. By the way, I looked up what scallywags actually means. Webster says it as a reprobate or a rascal, but it also means that it could be a white Republican Southerner living during the Restoration. Now, why they called them that, I have no idea. Okay. The Journal newspaper started in Fond du Lac in October of 1846. The earliest newspapers we have in microfilm are from that year. As you can see, whoops, well, I guess we won't see. Anyway, we were still a territory when these first papers were published. Before 1852, Fond du Lac law was enforced by the Brown County Sheriff, located in Green Bay.
Oh boy.
Getting the law to Fond du Lac could take up to a week. The population of Fond du Lac in 1842 is 300. Wisconsin became a state in 1848. By 1850, the population was 1,940. This is a drawing of the Darling Block. 1849, the Darling Block had our first stores, and it was a boarding house. It was located approximately on what is now West 2nd and Macy Street, where the Baptist church is, or was. In that year, we had 8 stores, 4 shoe shops, 5 blacksmith shops, 2 harness makers, 2 tailor shops, 3 good houses of entertainment. I don't know what that meant. 2 meeting houses, 3 mills in operation with 2 being built, no public burial ground. I have no idea what they did with people. By 18, they buried them where, probably on the land, especially on the farms. By 1860, the population had risen to 5,450, and 1870 it was already 12,000. During the 1860s, the industrial, railway, and steamships serving Fond du Lac were located in the vicinity of West Scott Street and the river. A swinging bridge over the Fond du Lac River on Arndt Street allowed steamboats to pass. This is another painting by Manscraft. This is what it looked like just on the other side of the river off Scott Street. Indian teepees. The Pytona is here. It is spelled wrong. I don't know who. I think Manscraft painted this one too. Shows them unloading the boats. But that was our main way that we received things here, because the roads were so bad. It was the nucleus around which our little village centered, actually. Good share of the transportation was by water in those days, with Scott Street Landing being the only village docking place. Techeetah also had an area for steamboats to tie up. The area around Scott Street was known as Lower Town. This painting by Manscraft, as I said, was one of Fond du Lac's artists. I wish these both, the 2 that I've shown you, are both at the Historical Society. And I believe they're hanging in the museum. Law and order did not really keep up with the growing population. Actually, in early days, people who lived in Fond du Lac had to look out for their own protection. That lasted until Fond du Lac secured its city charter in 1852. In pioneer days, a small building on Portland Street served as a lockup. It actually resembled a smokehouse. It wasn't until 1895 that the law was changed and a board of police and fire commissioners was created to manage both departments. This is a Fond du Lac police badge owned by the Fond du Lac County Historical Society. I have no idea who number 9 was. County jail was built in 1870 and was located on Linden Street. It came under the wrecking ball in 1956 when a new jail was built within the safety building. This song was found in the newspaper files at the Fond du Lac Public Library, and the lyrics to it, I have no idea what the music sounds like, but the lyrics to it are in your handout. It's dated 1941, and I have no idea who wrote that. This is the women's building in Wapon. Wapon State Prison began in 1851, and by December 1852 it housed 2 female inmates as well as a number of men. Females occupied the upper floor of the main building in the middle of the prison yard. A few years later, a building for females was built mostly by the male inmates. That is where the female prisoners were kept until Techeetah Prison opened in the 1930s. Seems that Fond du Lac had some sort of problem with cannons, especially on the 4th of July during those early years. It's reported in the history book by Glaze, and I have that listed on your handout. That book, by the way, is here. It is not, you can't check it out. If we could find someone with lots of money who could republish that, it would be fun. During the celebration of July 4th, 1847, a young man was killed when a cannon fired prematurely. Lower Town had this cannon sitting for years without fixtures, and it was large and heavy, so the children left it alone. It was used on special occasions, and this time they put the cannon on a pile of railway ties, but when it fired, it exploded, and the young man was killed. It was taken to Peacock and White's foundry and melted down. I could not find what the young man's name was. They never published that. It was only a few years later, in 1855, and again on July 4th, when Sheriff Beaver was in a hurry loading and firing another cannon at the courthouse, when the cartridge unexpectedly exploded, shattering his right arm. It was necessary to amputate the arm. As if that wasn't enough, I don't know what happened to that cannon either. The foundry of Peacock and White, which was located in Lower Town, built a cannon after the model of the Atwater rifle during the early years of the Civil War. It was 5.5 feet long and had a 2.5-inch bore. Alex White, owner of the Peacock White foundry, was the person who decided we needed another cannon. The cannon was a breech loader, and it really required much experimenting to fire it. One cold day after a snowfall, a group of friends hauled it to the lake shore, and it was fired twice, after which the breech pins stuck and it could not be fired again. Wondering how far it had reached, they set out and walked at least 2.5 miles. They found where it had struck the snow and bounded. It has always been claimed that it landed in the town of Calumet. But that is a lot further than 2.5 miles from our lake shore. It is said that this cannon ended up at the Army Navy Museum in Washington, D.C. I could not verify that. Did not know. Madame de Neveu tells us in her writings, which are here at the library, during the 1830s, the Indians in this area were not very dangerous. However, if given the chance, they were clever thieves. They stole crops, horses, Edward Pyre's only cow on the 3rd of May of 1838. In addition, Mr. Pyre, one of our first settlers, had a pig that he raised to be almost 300 pounds. According to written accounts, the porker disappeared without even leaving a grease spot. During that time, the Indians also confiscated a horse. On the 9th of December, 1839, Oliver, son of Colbert Pyre, nearly took his foot off with an axe, the cut being just in front of the instep. The bleeding could not be stopped until Edward Pyre remembered that putting a poultice of dog's hair on a wound would stop the bleeding. That done, it took 2 months for Oliver to attempt to walk again, but he lived. In 1845, the citizens of Fond du Lac congregated at the sheriff's office, all in an uproar. They complained because a set of brass and steel shackles had been purchased by the sheriff for the amount of $2.50. Citizens said it was an outrageous extravagance. And others, many of whom were known to end up in jail every once in a while, protested, saying it was the height of indignity to put shackles on a man in a free country. Every once in a while, Fond du Lac made the national news. 1847, the city council passed an ordinance prohibiting nude bathing in the 2 branches of the Fond du Lac River, but did permit it after 9 p.m., except in the summer. Again, making national news, the councilman passed an ordinance which I wonder if that's still on the books. Some really I think the one for spitting on the sidewalk is still on the books. It's never been taken off. Again, making national news, the councilman passed an ordinance which provided for posting of pictures of all known habitual drunkards in all Fond du Lac saloons. If a bartender was caught selling liquor to a posted man, he could be forced out of business. Some of these, let's see here, this is the Peacock and White Foundry. This was their ad in the 1872 directory. They were quite a huge place. There we are. Disgraceful row. You won't be able to read these, but it was the best I could do because there were not photographs in the newspaper until the 1890s. Scott Street or Lower Town seemed to have the most lively taverns where trouble erupted every week. On a Monday evening in May of 1850, a group of Germans had assembled at the tavern of Mr. Koenig's and were enjoying their evening. They were dancing and having a few beers when rowdies entered the establishment and broke up the good time. The next evening, the Germans were again gathered at the same place, and the newspaper reported that the drunken loafers of the night before, using indecent language, attacked the Germans with stones, bricks, bats, and axes, demolished the windows, doors, and furniture, endangering lives. One German received a fractured skull, while another was stabbed by a knife. The article ends by saying that the district attorney should wake up and attend to his duty. I've substituted for some of the clip art so that you're not bored out of your minds here. The afternoon of July 7th, 1858 seemed to be going along smoothly until it was discovered that a fire had started in a barn located behind Van Dresser's meat market. The buildings were old, rickety, and soon the whole west side of Main Street between the Globe Hotel and Dormer and Green in Warner's Block, which was between 2nd and Court Streets, that was consumed by flame. It was on the west side of Main. The newspaper claims that thousands rushed to the area, and eventually it was contained. Many men, and women too, were exhausted and sank down where they stood. The reporter went on to say that at sundown, the scourge of the human race, infernal whiskey, was passed out to the crowd. Much of it was drank. As a result, it was a scene of the most disgraceful conduct caused by rum ever seen in Fond du Lac. It was during 1856 when Alden Hull and his wife made the trip from New York to Wisconsin by water, coming across the Great Lakes. They were several weeks on board, and upon arrival, they wanted to purchase land. In order to purchase their first home, according to Mrs. Hull, they had to pay 50% interest on the principal. We think we've got it, Dad. In the history again by A.T. Glaze, one of the first recorded robberies stated, on Monday, August 23rd, 1847, Dr. Cater's house was entered by robbers and $142 in cash taken. Also in the Glaze Book, we find an article about John Riley, who was a darky with an Irish name. He had the first barber shop in Fond du Lac. The year was 1848. The shop was a small frame building and stood next to the building that held the Fond du Lac Journal newspaper. Between the two was an alley that led to Swineford's blacksmith shop, while Riley's wife was an Indian, and the wood house in the back of the shop was a favorite place for powwows. Even though the law said there was to be no alcohol bought for the Indians, the Rileys did anyway, especially Mrs. Riley. Their shop was frequently the scene of drunken powwows, and it was quite annoying to those at the journal office trying to work. So they called Forbes Humiston, who was the constable at that time, to see if he could stop this. Well, he went into the building. In less than a minute, he came flying out of the woodshed and ran as fast as his short legs would carry him. He later told them that there were too many bright butcher knives in there to suit him. This is everyone thinks that there weren't divorces in the 1800s. But there were. This is from 1847 when Wisconsin was still territory. Had to be inserted in the newspaper for 6 weeks. My question is, right here, it says, by her next friend, H.L. Wilkins. Who's that? That's the way the marriages were noted in the paper. Some, if they knew who they were, they would put a little verse underneath. However, okay, if a woman left her husband and just walked out on him, you would get one of these little cautions right down here. No bills will be paid on the account of my wife. But I did run into one that says, all persons are hereby warned against trusting or harboring any of my children who may seek to get trusted on my account, as I shall pay no debts of their contracting from the 22nd day of October. That was the way they let everybody know they were on their way to a divorce. Well, we get to 1850. There was a shooting affray. It seems that Harvey Brewer had settled on a small piece of land that was actually on the Indian reservation near Stockbridge, hoping it would soon come up for sale. Well, Samuel Stevens also had his eye on the same parcel. He went to the cabin to simply order Brewer off the land. Well, after a few times listening to Stevens ordering him off the land, Brewer simply shot him. He blew a hole in his left side. He immediately went to authorities, gave himself up, and ended up in the Fond du Lac jail. His bail was set at $1,000, and it wasn't expected that Brewer would survive, but he did. And then, in 1858, there was an election that was the closest in Fond du Lac history. John B. Wilbur was running against George W. Sawyer for county treasurer. Wilbur won by 1 vote. The city canvassing board was made up of 5 of the county's finest men. Everyone came up with the same count, 2,589 to 2,588. Who says every vote doesn't count? Another destructive fire. This one took place in January, a very cold January. It was a Monday morning, and the alarm was set up that the roof of the Case and Alling store was on fire. It was followed shortly thereafter by an explosion because the fire had reached the storeroom where the gunpowder was. It was 22 below zero. It could not be stopped until all the buildings on the east side of Main between 1st and 2nd Street were destroyed. A lot of the goods in various stores and shops were saved. People from all over Fond du Lac came to help. A number of persons had their clothes burned on their backs, so they threw water on each other to extinguish the flames and the flying cinders. Many had their hands, feet, ears, or faces frozen. There was a reservoir at the corner of Main and 2nd Street and was credited with saving a great deal as there was a good supply of water. On the downside, thieves made off with items from the stores that had been saved. Our reporter stated that such heartless and degraded wretches deserved no mercy. It was not known exactly how the fire started. I think this is one of my favorites. The headline said, a case of poisoning. The deceased was Bridget Rice, wife of Patrick, their residence on First Street. She had died the previous Wednesday, claiming before her death she had been poisoned. A few months before she died, Bridget and her husband Patrick took in a homeless lady with 4 children. Her name was Elizabeth Conroy. She had made gruel on Tuesday evening for Bridget, who was not feeling real well. Bridget said it didn't taste right. Elizabeth pretended to taste it, and Bridget finally ate it. A post-mortem examination of contents of the stomach, and this was 1859, was performed. The husband violently protested the post-mortem, but calmed down when his priest, Father Dale of St. Louis Church, was called. It was found that there was arsenic in large quantities that Bridget had consumed. Both Bridget and Patrick were arrested and convicted of murder. October 1859, Fond du Lac hosted a huge celebration because a railroad track between Fond du Lac and Chicago had finally been finished. People came from Chicago, Janesville, and Watertown, and many other places to Fond du Lac so they could celebrate. Construction had started sometime before from both ends. They finally had conjoined the track. 25 carloads of men, women, and children arrived in Fond du Lac to view the parade, listen to speeches, and attend a banquet. The festivities concluded with a grand ball at Amory Hall with everyone in attendance. They danced the evening away. Later, at least 1,600 people departed for Chicago in 11 coaches and 2 baggage cars. And I kind of did a little math there. It's over 200 people in one car. The cars were crowded, but spirits were high. 8 miles below Watertown at Belleville, which is now Johnson's Creek, while the train was meandering at approximately 10 miles an hour, an ox grazing near the unfenced track was frightened by the snorting locomotive and jumped on the track directly in front of the engine. This threw the engine and the next 5 cars from the track. The cars contained about 200 people each, and they were thrown every which way. Tim Strong, son of T.F. Strong Sr., found a horse and buggy somewhere, went into Watertown for help. Physicians and medicine arrived as soon as it was possible. 14 people were pulled from the debris deceased, 7 from Fond du Lac. A gentleman by the name of Van Buren Smeed from Fond du Lac lived 6 more weeks in Watertown in their hospital in distressing pain, but he did die. One of those killed was Jerome Mason, who was thrown on a hot stove and burned to death. Because they had the stoves were on one end of the car, and they just fired them up with wood, and of course, if you get thrown against one of those, you're going to die. We are told, now whether this is true or not, I don't know, the mate to the ox that caused the wreck was killed at almost the same place by the same locomotive. Who knows if that was true? That was the article, which goes on and on and on for many columns. 1860. Up to 1860, all domestic animals within the city were allowed to run at large, including pigs. It seems that J.C. Clun had a special cow that was really getting on the housewives' nerves. At the insistence of these many housewives, a law was passed because Clun's Bossy was a genius at opening gates of any size, hooked or latched. She would patiently work at a latch with her horns until it opened, sometimes taking hours. Her target was usually a private garden. and housewives were very proud of their gardens then. They put many hours in tending to them. If Bossy was driven away, she would just return when the coast was clear. During the day, she would wander the streets, probably staking out her next target, and at night, the yards and gardens were hers for the taking. Finally, a law was passed that all critters must be enclosed, confined, or tied. These are clip art, of course, but it reminded me so much of what happened in Fond du Lac in 1862. It was September. Word spread of Indians going berserk on the east side of Fond du Lac County with a massacre in progress. A full-blown panic set in. In the month before, Minnesota had suffered the same fate when somewhere near 800 settlers had been killed by the rebelling Dakota Indians. Newspapers had been full of the news. As the wagons of families poured into Fond du Lac, they told of fire, murder, and that the savages were but a short distance away, hundreds strong, ready to massacre anyone in their way. Streets on the east side of Fond du Lac were filled with teams and lined with refugees, and all told of butchery. News came that the family of Egbert Foster at Lake de Nevieux had been butchered, and the crops had been burned. 4 men went out to see if they could find where the band of Indians had gone through, and only found a group of refugees at the still standing home of Mr. Foster, who was alive and well. After most of the people living east of Fond du Lac had raced into Fond du Lac in wagons and horseback, it was discovered that 5 Indian woodcutters between Chilton and Manitowoc had gotten into a fight between themselves. They were the only natives in the region, but the scare had spread from farm to farm, resulting in Fond du Lac's Great Indian Panic of 1862. A disgraceful affray. Everything was an affray in those days. Half of 1866 was over when a shooting occurred one June evening as men were coming and going up the stairs to the Young Men's Association rooms in Rupping's block. It was located on the 2nd floor at that time, which was, I'm thinking it was probably above Brickell's Tavern. General Hamilton, as president of the association, had opened the polls for voting of officers for the coming year. As he was going down the stairs, on his way to the ground level, he met Robert A. Baker on his way up. Baker was cashier of the Farmers Mechanics Bank, and these 2 men had detested each other for quite some time. Hamilton was 2 steps below Baker when Baker turned and called him a name. Hamilton turned and grabbed him by the left collar and yelled, "You little villain, what do you mean?" Baker at once reached into his side left breast pocket of his coat and fired his pistol through his own coat without drawing it out. They struggled for the pistol, but Hamilton fell down the steps to the bottom, at which time Baker shot a 2nd time. Helped to his feet, it was not realized that Hamilton had indeed been shot twice, the first to lodge in his groin and the second grazing his left temple. Baker was immediately arrested, spent the evening in the Fond du Lac jail. Almost 6 months later, he was acquitted. He was never charged. Right next to, as I was reading this, that's Robert Baker's, his ad. That, I think that again is in 1876. Anyway, here's the circuit court for 1866, which was right next to the Hamilton article. It tells a little bit, I have it underlined there, that Jason Breed, there was a court case against Jason Breed on Thursday, May 24th. He was indicted for rape. He pled not guilty, but the very next day, the 25th, which is down a little further, with the jury quickly assembled, he was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in hard labor in Mopon State Prison. He started out with 10 days of solitary confinement. Then we go on, and here he is. His wife is divorcing him. There are 18 divorces for this month alone in Fond du Lac. There were divorces in the 1800s. There were lots of them. August 6, 1868. Last Monday morning, a number of our hotel proprietors and saloon keepers were arrested and taken before the police court. They were fined for selling beer on Sunday. And here's a horrid murder for money. The Fond du Lac Journal of March 25, 1869 told us some boys who were in the woods near the city when they discovered the body of a man. The woods by the city was Ingram's Grove, which is right by the high school. So that was kind of out of town at that time. The body had running quickly to get help. The body was brought into Fond du Lac. The man had been murdered. Evidence in the snow showed a desperate struggle. Skull had been fractured above the left ear, his lower jaw broken, face badly cut. He had been in the taverns and stores with a Negro by the name of Fred Williams. Williams had been hired by the man to accompany him to New Orleans for business. The murdered man had a roll of money with him, but did not have it when found dead. The last man he was with was Williams, so he was charged. He was found guilty of the murder, never found any money. While awaiting trial, Williams escaped jail. He was captured, but he was then chained to the floor within a cell to prevent any further attempt to break out. He went to prison at Mopon until August of 1879 when he was released. His lawyers went before the Supreme Court and it was determined that he did not have a proper and regular trial. The young man murdered was a visitor to Fond du Lac. His last name was Young, we did find out. Attorneys for Williams were C.K. Pyer and James Bass, who defended him in the original trial. In the next winter, after Williams was released, he froze both his feet and died as a result. I couldn't resist this. Smokers, when you feel blue about the state of the country or the state of your pocket, if your wife is cross or your mother-in-law has come to live with you, just go to Wolf's, a few doors north of Patty House, and buy a cigar. You'll be happy while that lasts, and perhaps Wolf will trust you for another. It would be just like him, for he is the most accommodating, best-natured man on the street. During the 1860s, mail was not delivered to each house. A notification was put into the newspaper listing the names of those who had mail at the post office. You had to go pick it up yourself. 1870. Oh, and by the way, if you ever get into any of these newspapers, these are the ads, which are absolutely, they're just fantastic. They're not boring like they are now. This is the page for the Glaze Book that I keep talking about. Incidents and anecdotes of the early days and history of business, and goes on and on and on and on. But there's so much in there. You will, if you have time someday, just come and sit up in the reference department and read it. 1870. This decade, Fond du Lac would see their new jail finished and the county insane asylum completed. People judged insane had always been sent to Oshkosh for treatment. Mr. Glaze tells us that there was a Davis, there was lots of Davis people living in Fond du Lac. They were assigned strange first names by the population. but none resented the names, and they did respond when called by them. Pig's Foot Davis sold pig's feet. Soapy Davis made and sold soap. Stoneboat Davis used a stone-boat as a vehicle, and I can't quite imagine that because I don't think those had wheels. At least my grandpa's didn't. Whiskey Davis, noted for drinking his own whiskey, but he never traded. Black Davis had a dark complexion. Grocery Davis had a grocery. Sawmill Davis owned a sawmill. Steamboat Davis worked on a steamboat for B.F. Moore. This was another I couldn't resist. This says, a few years ago, Fond du Lac had a reputation for suicides. Now, provisions, clothing are so cheap it doesn't cost much more to live than to die. So it's been a long time since we've had a suicide. Unbelievable. Once you start looking at these newspapers, I almost got locked in the library one night. Because I was reading and I forgot I was there. This was something that happened a lot. A lot of people died lighting their stove with kerosene. Mrs. James Shambo, she lived at 152 West Scott, and I'm not sure if this house still exists. She was lighting her stove using kerosene. It was about noon because there were live coals in the stove. There was an explosion. It could be heard for blocks. 2 children in the house were not hurt. She was set ablaze and knocked to the ground senseless. A gentleman riding past the house stopped and ran in where he found her horribly burned. He put out the fire and went for a doctor, but 3 doctors tended to her, but she did pass away. I call this the official crime. Crime was not limited to adults. In February of 1876, St. Paul's Cathedral discovered that some young boys had made off with offerings that were put into a locked box. It was in the vestibule of the church. They apparently used either a wire or line with a fishhook on the end, and almost every envelope was fished out of the offerings. They estimated that the envelopes contained anywhere from 5 cents to $5. And another serious shooting affray. John Connell, watchman at the My Hills Manufacturing Company, he was instructed not to let anyone into the facility unless they had a pass. Well, John Hardenberg, the engineer, said, "I want to come in." He said, "Nope, you can't do it." He was warned away a number of times, but he tried to break into the door to the engine room. Connell finally allowed him entrance, but as soon as he did, Hardenberg proceeded to beat him senseless, ripping his shirt off and causing cuts to his face. He told him to leave, drew his revolver. He shot once trying to scare him, but the result was that he just got angrier. He fired a second time, hitting him in the upper leg. He finally left, but he came back with one of the managers. When they arrived, Hardenberg, the one that was shot, picked up an iron bar and went after Connell again. No one knows why he wanted to get in, but and they thought that the wound was not determined to be serious. However, he was in critical condition the next day because the wound had become infected, and he did die. Only a few months later, Fond du Lac witnessed another shooting. John Gill was known around Fond du Lac as a ruffian and had a reputation for fighting. And generally the population of Fond du Lac was afraid of him and steered clear of him. John had his eye on a girl who worked at a boarding house and saloon owned by John Shore. She didn't want anything to do with Gill. One Friday evening, Gill went into the kitchen where the girl worked and insisted on seeing her. She told her boss about it. He went to get his revolver that he kept in the bar. Well, Gill soon brandished a knife, said that he would kill everybody in the place He was told to leave and made a motion as if to draw a gun, so Shore shot him through the head. Shore ended up in jail for 6 weeks. After a trial of almost 3 weeks, the jury declared him not guilty after 10 minutes. That was, I'm not keeping up with myself here. A young boy about 15 years old, his name was Constantine. I have to say that slow. They had been playing around Chandler's elevator one Friday afternoon with a group of boys. Later in the day, the workmen were watching the drawing off of a bin of barley for shipment when they noticed that the flow had been stopped. Something was jamming the outlet. One of the workmen put his hand up the spout and discovered a human foot. The body of the young man was found at the bottom of the bin. They tried to resuscitate him, but he was gone. Now this one, it's a one, you probably can hardly see it. I almost missed this article because there's only one paragraph long, and it contains one sentence. And it says, Clinton Welsh, who murdered Kelvin Bostwick at Stockbridge in January 1876 by cutting off his leg with an axe and carrying him into the woods where he died with the object that he, the prisoner, might have uninterrupted intercourse with Bostwick's wife, was found guilty in the Calumet court on Saturday last and was sentenced for life to Wigwam. I keep thinking of Miss O'Brien, who was my English teacher at Goodrich. She loved diagramming sentences. I'd like to see her do that. Then, in December of 1876, Mary Rose, a resident of Ripon, was sent to prison for stealing dresses. At this time, the women were housed in the Mopon prison on the floor above the men. She was attracted to another inmate whose name, and I hate this word, but his name was Nigger Sam. He was serving time for assault and battery. Well, they married, but Mary found that Sam had a wife. And when Mary returned to the judge, he told her she was free as long as Sam already had a wife. Well, she then explained that, well, she had a husband too, but he didn't amount to anything. So she thought she had a perfect right to marry one who did. It's just amazing. And there's just a very short one here. The worst fears of the relatives of the missing huckster, Edward McGuire, have been realized. The unfortunate man has married. There is a hostile Indian in the lockup. This was November 1878, a number of years after the 1862 panic. The aunt of Ebenezer Anthony filed a complaint that the brave, who was full of fire water, was raising a bad spirit around the family wigwam. He had assaulted her with a pair of scissors, attempting to send her to the happy hunting ground. She showed a bloody hand where he had stabbed her. Officers Crane and Como went to the teepee on Superior Street and captured the warrior. So there were teepees on Superior Street at that time. This was 1878. While on his way to the station, the Indian explained to the officers that he was a great chief. He had 19,000 fighting men at his call. When he raised his men, not one white man in the area would have a scalp left. He was said to be a little more docile the next morning. Election day in Marshfield, 1876. Two neighbors were at the bar, lifting a few. Jacob Litzen and Andrew Nett were at Beau's saloon, drinking all day and into the evening until about 11 o'clock. Litzen went outside and stood on the steps, and it wasn't long before Nett followed. Nett started to pass by Litzen, but stopped suddenly and with a large jackknife and a backward thrust, struck Litzen in the lower abdominal region. He severed the large artery that passes into the right leg. Running back into the saloon, Litzen screamed that he had been stabbed. He lived only 30 minutes, bleeding to death. The village was dumbfounded, but soon talk of lynching started, and Nett was whisked off to the Fond du Lac jail to deter any further talk. Nett was 35 years old, a bachelor, while Litzen was only 24 and had been married only 6 weeks. It had been stated that Nett had always been rather quarrelsome. In an interview with a reporter, Nett claimed that Litzen picked on his brother, that there had been difficulty between their families. The reporter went on to describe Nett. He was 5'6" tall, gray eyes, dark hair, not pleasing features. His teeth are broken and his speech is imperfect. Nett said he wasn't aware he had stabbed the victim until he was arrested at his home. He didn't really seem to be troubled with what he did. A few days later, Joe Williams, a resident of Osceola, went on a drunken spree that last started on Friday, continued until Sunday afternoon. At home, he raised particular Cain, beating his wife and assaulting several other parties. He was arrested, but escaped, managed to get to Fond du Lac, where he visited several saloons. Richard's saloon, he started fighting and cleared out the house. At Bresna's saloon, he attacked a quiet man, minding his own business. When officers came in, some of his friends got him away, and he was not prosecuted. In November of 1878, Adam Hacks and Herman Meyer were walking home one evening and coming to 5 Points, which is, for some of you, it used to be 5 Points. It's now 4 Points, but it's military and Western. They found a large piece of meat laying on the walk in front of Funk's butcher shop. They noticed a pane of glass missing in one of the windows and heard movement inside. The back door was open. They went to call for police when all of a sudden, a large Newfoundland dog sprang from the broken window and ran off. They were laughing so hard they had to sit down. The owner of the shop was called and everything was closed and boarded up. Peace and quiet once more reigned in the neighborhood. Let's see. Yeah, Brasted's great. Judge Brasted had a brand new jail, and the police made a raid on several of the castles of the Demi-Monde in Fond du Lac. They had already taken in 2 drunks, and by the time they were finished that night, they had 15 people in the new jail. He held court at the police office on Monday morning. Will Seaver, drunk, $3, paid. George Parker, fictitious name, drunk, paid. How did they know that? Mrs. Jenny Jubay, I think it is, keeper of House of Ill Fame, $8 plus costs, $10 paid. The following were convicted of being inmates of a House of Ill Fame: Cora Lewis, Ella Morse, Lena Wiley, May Ingersoll, Frankie Brown, Agnes Snyder, and the Bresnahan, I think it was Pat, J.J. Jones, Patrick Callahan, Charles Snyder, and William Murray. All were fined and paid except for Scanlon, Bresnahan, and Callahan, who were jailed for 7 days instead of paying. In checking the city directory, I find that Madame Jubay is listed at 655 Main Street. She is also noted as being French, and her occupation is dressmaker. In March of 1979, according to this slide, She swore out a warrant for one of her employees by the name of Mary Hines for the theft of several dresses. Mary was detained at the train depot where she was sent to leave by the midnight train that evening. She spent several days in jail. 1880. The next 10 years started out peacefully enough, but again, one afternoon in September, a fire was discovered. It was the courthouse. It went up in a flash, and the newspaper stated, "As we go to press, the flames are still licking the walls of the old hall, and ere this reaches the reader, the old Fond du Lac courthouse will be in smoldering ruins. Peace be to its ashes." The county court had adjourned for the day at 3 p.m. 15 minutes later, the building was in a blaze. Most of the records in the registrar's office were saved thanks to the firemen. The article went on to say, and continued into the next day, by saying, there were few mourners. Connell Hans is still chopping away at the steps to make sure the destruction is complete. Trees in front of the courthouse were preserved and the grass was not scorched a particle. The district attorney claims that he loaned a certain ex-judge 2 matches 15 minutes before the fire broke out. Senator Sutherland attributes the fire to a very hot suit tried there yesterday. A piece of crepe and a horseshoe were nailed to the registrar's office this morning, so there's at least one pretended mourner. The key to the courthouse is lost. There is a reward for its recovery. This is the one. This is the one I'm blocking out the name of the people because I don't. The accused, now the spring of 1881, this is in the fall of 1881. The spring of 1881 brought an article in the Commonwealth reporting an incident of incest in one of Fond du Lac's townships. The accused disappeared from the area shortly after the newspaper published his misdeed. But probably in need of money, he returned to his home in September to dispose of property so he could leave permanently. His wife notified the sheriff. He had returned. A warrant was made out while the undersheriff proceeded to his residence. He eluded the undersheriff, but at 9 p.m., he returned to the house where his wife told him, "The whole neighborhood is looking for you." His wife later told the sheriff, and he claimed he would rather kill himself before going to jail. Supposedly, he went to the house and attempted suicide. He shot himself in the head 3 times. The first 2 grazed his head. The third entered the brain, but it didn't kill him. Do you have a little help from his wife? The newspaper tells us, and this I'm quoting, the shooting took place at 9:30 p.m. on Saturday. No doctor was called. He died at 3 a.m. on Sunday. It goes on to say, he plunged about more like a headless fowl than a human being, uncared for and unmourned. He was apparently buried without a marker because I don't find him anywhere in Fond du Lac County. Soothing syrup. This is, it's a gossip column concerning Virginia Condé and her husband Frank, who have been the talk of the town. Everybody wanted to know what was going on. She used the pen name, she worked for 2 local newspapers and used the pen name of Jenny Barron. She charged her husband with cruel and inhuman treatment. He said if she wants a divorce, she can have it. 2 children, age 5 and 2. And oh, by the way, Mrs. Condé is the sister of Mrs. W.H. Diltz, a well-known local lady. So they pulled the whole family in on it. I couldn't resist the bull. Young colored man named Frank Cleveland had an exciting adventure with a bull yesterday on 4th Street near Ellis. A board covered the bull's eyes, and 20 feet of rope dangled from his head, the other end held by Cleveland, who walked along leisurely, his soul filled with thoughts of watermelon and other luxurious fantasies. Our newspaper never failed to have a comment about colored people. Suddenly the bull made a rush, and before he was aware of the bull's intention, a portion of Cleveland's wardrobe was on the bull's horns, and he was tossed in the air. When he came down, the bull rushed over to him, but he got up and ran to a fence. Cleveland's nether garments were then in such a state that his dearest friend would hesitate about introducing him into the bosom of his family. In the meantime, the employer of the boy, Mr. G.W. Yancey, learned about the disagreement between the bull and the boy, and he came to his rescue with a club. From the stern expression on Mr. Yancey's face, it is surmised that he came to give the bull severe chastisement. The bull lowered his head and made a rush, and Mr. Yancey's stern expression turned to one of surprise. He also leaped over the fence. The boy behind a tree nearly choked with laughter while the bull lashed his tail in indignation. The bull was finally secured, and all is well. But that happened right on 4th near Ellis. Henry Stutz was arrested this afternoon, November 1886, for drunkenness in the vicinity of the Ruggles Street School, where he was frightening children. This is the same man whose wife is alleged to have left him 33 times. The couple has been twice divorced and 3 times married. Application for another divorce is pending. 1889, attempted murder. Dr. Miller, the cancer specialist, was arrested Tuesday, charged with malicious trespass. He loaded the wood that would be used with the stove with gunpowder, with the intention of blowing up his recently divorced wife. His scheme succeeded so far as to blow the cook stove to pieces. Did not result in personal damage. Penalty for the offense is $100 or 6 months in prison. He is in jail. Stan Gores is one of my favorite people. That he is gone now, but he wrote articles for the Reporter for many, many, many years. And I've been trying to collect all of his, and I usually can go back and find the original article that he was talking about. But this one I couldn't. But there was 2 young lovers standing at the corner of Division and Harney Street, which is now Park Avenue. They found themselves the subject of a newspaper article. No names were mentioned, however, a bit of advice was given. They were told that when they kissed, they should not make a sound like the extrication of a cow's foot from the mud. As we move into the 1890s, we find that murders and attacks on fellow citizens seem to become more frequent. Lower Town posed a problem with its saloons. Almost all the industry was located nearby, and it was an easy task to stop in for a few frosty ones after a long day or an evening at the mills and foundries. They were open 24 hours. Wow. Both the mills and the taverns. We found an article regarding Fred Rautenberg, who had a wicked cut on his head from what he claimed was done by a knife in the hands of his brother-in-law, Rudolph Lemke. Charges were dropped when he came to a settlement with Lemke, who paid $10 cash, the surgeon's bill, and wages for a period of time Rautenberg had to be off work. The reporter didn't stop there. He goes on to say that this is not an uncommon occurrence. On especially on Sunday, in the saloons on Scott Street. Now, this is almost 20 years after the other article saying how bad Scott Street is. Okay, this is 20 years later. They're still at it. This time, the free-for-all began at 7:30 in the evening, and about 15 to 20 people were involved, both men and women. Clubs, beer kegs, knives, bricks, bats, and any available missile was used. Participants rolled in the mud and were covered with blood. Just a few weeks before, 2 men had battered each other with beer glasses, and around the same time, 2 men had taken their revolvers out, threatening each other. The reporter said it was not unusual to see women reeling drunk down there, and it is reported that the husband of one woman who gets drunk was found beating her with a billiard cue until stopped by bystanders. And horse races was not an uncommon sight. The first circus to make a stop in Fond du Lac was July of 1852. It was the Mays Brothers United States Circus. And when the circus arrived in Fond du Lac for many, many years, it was wonderful. There was a parade that came from the train depot, animals, clowns, beautiful women on horseback, performing trick horses and everything, especially the elephants. On a Monday in June of 1890, the Robinson Circus held its performance when a tremendous storm came up, but the show kept going. Finally, it was so bad that the ringmaster told everyone to leave the best way they could. That started a small panic. A party of young men and women, seeking shelter from the wind and the rain, took advantage of what they supposed was a shed, but were horrified to discover by a flash of lightning that they were sheltered by a huge elephant. The newspapers stated it was the general opinion that people got more than they paid for, and what Robinson's actors could not furnish, nature made up for it. And this is something that happened years ago too, where a policeman is accused of killing a man that he was trying to take into custody. Michael Cahill made a dying statement in January of 1891. They had taken him to the Windsor Hotel where he did die. He said, "I expect to die in a short time and make this as my dying statement. I was in the back room and walked in and saw Doherty at the bar." Doherty is the policeman. "I sat in a chair. Doherty came up to me and said, 'I have a warrant for you, Cahill.' I got off the chair and started for the back door. When I took hold of it, he shot me in the back. Then I turned around and clinched him. I was afraid to go out through the door for fear he would shoot me again. I threw him down and he shot again without hitting me. He then pointed his gun at my face. It was cocked. I turned it away and hit him. Then we scuffled about a minute longer and I turned away and ran to Mike Schaefer's saloon. When he said he had a warrant in the barroom, I said, 'Have you?' and started for the door. He said, 'You can't get away from me now.' I did not strike or lay hands on him before he shot. That is all that took place. I have nothing else to say. All this happened in the saloon on Main Street in the city of Fond du Lac, kept by Charles Years." Doherty, the policeman, was charged with murder and was found guilty of murder in the 4th degree, which is punishable for 1 to 2 years in state prison or 1 year in the county jail, or a fine of not more than $1,000. He paid the $1,000 fine and did not go to jail, and I believe he continued being a police officer. Out there. Finally, in the 1890s, we are beginning to find drawings or some kind of picture of people. This is Oscar Shuri. He was a resident of Fond du Lac, and he was the local Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is a drawing of him in his Sunday best, as was in the July 29, 1893 newspaper, while the article explained that there were also times when he looked like a tramp. He had attended the Cotton Street ME Church for the winter of 1892 and 93. But after that, he went back to his old dishonest ways. In this article, it seems the reporters try and explain why Shuri turned out the way he did. When only 17, he stole a horse and rode to Green Bay with it, along with brothers Stephen and William Mullen. He got 4 years in Mopon. That's just as bad as a kid grabbing a car and taking it. No, he just took a horse. After he was released, the police were puzzled by a series of burglaries. When they searched his residence, they found most of the stolen articles. He got 5 years and was released in 1892. Appearing before the judge again, this time in 1893, he said if he wants something, he just takes it. He can't help himself, and he stated to the judge that he wished that he could be sentenced to death because he could never live through another stint at Wigwam prison. Oscar and his wife, who was also charged, claimed that William Booms was their accomplice. As I said before, I have a program on black people, and they are not politically correct, let's put it that way. The Coons have a fight. Okay. During the late 1800s, Fond du Lac had an African-American population of approximately 300 people. Most lived on West 12th, East 12th Street, Morris Street, in that area. Our newspapers delighted in writing articles regarding the African-American Methodist Zion Church located on West 12th Street and various things that happened with their members. The headline of the article, Coons Have a Fight, West Walton was slashed with a razor. Gives you an idea of the attitude of the newspaper of those who were of the black race. The article starts out, there was a coon fight over in Darkytown last night, and razors went a-flying through the air. Of course, at the bottom of the problem was a woman. Walton was out walking with Mrs. Mary Cleveland, a colored woman who resides on Grant Street and who has a husband at home dying of consumption. They met Will Washington, and he claimed that Mary was his girl. She told him to stop arguing and order some beer. That done, there was then an argument as to who should drink the beer. Walton hit Washington. Washington slashed Walton. People in the area heard his cries, and he explained that he had been slashed by that woolly coon. Mary said it was nothing, but the cuts were 3 inches long and a ½ inch deep. The reporter claimed that most of the colored residents of Fond du Lac will have nothing to do with her. 5 days later, an article appeared that Mary's husband, Edward, was divorcing her. He had gone to Judge Richter and decided that enough was enough. This would be the first colored divorce that ever came up for trial in Fond du Lac, but unfortunately, Edward Cleveland passed away before it came to court. And here's road rage in March of 1897. John Bone, a resident of Empire Township, was described as an old, unsophisticated German who understood English, but didn't speak it well. John Bone was the victim in this case. He was also a little hard of hearing. He testified that on the evening of June 22nd, he was on his way home from town. He had stopped and had 3 drinks about an hour apart, and he was not under the influence. He was on the Empire Road, 4th Street, when Chris Yeager came up behind him and with an oath demanded that he drive faster. Bone replied he was going fast enough. Yeager then drove up on the side of Bone's wagon and struck him with a stick about 5 feet long. After several strikes, Bone fell off the wagon and the horses took off for home. John Oiding brought the team home after stopping the driverless wagon and took it to the Bones farm. Realizing that his father was missing, Ed Bone searched for him, found him 8 feet from the road, partially covered with weeds and grass, and unconscious. Ed carried his father home as he was unable to stand. Both his arms were broken, and his head was covered in blood. Chris Yeager was arrested, and at the trial it was noted that a lawsuit between Bone and Chris Yeager's father had taken place a few years earlier. And there were several people to testify about that fact. At least 20 witnesses for the state had testified. Those witnesses for Yeager were more or less character witnesses. Toward the end of the trial, Yeager himself did take the stand, denied any wrongdoing, although he admitted to seeing Bone in town. Chris was defended by Maurice McKenna, one of the foremost attorneys in Fond du Lac. The case was given to the jury, who debated until 5 a.m. the next morning. They had 4 choices: not guilty, plain assault, assault with a deadly weapon with an intent to do great bodily harm, assault with intent to commit murder. At 9 a.m., the verdict was read: assault with intent to commit murder. The district attorney defended the finding by saying, in the prime of his youth and strength, Yeager assaulted an old man bowed with years and bent with toil. He struck him with a club, aiming at his head where his strokes were sure to kill. He struck with such violence his victim fell senseless onto the roadside. Both arms were broken, and blow after blow was brought on that old gray head until the scalp hung in shreds, and was a part of it was knocked off into the dust. He left the old man quivering in his blood, and he just left. Kristen Yeager was sentenced to 7 years at Mopon State Prison. Another murder. At the hotel and salon of John Beeman, it was 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning. William Payne was among a group of patrons in the saloon. He had been drinking, as had everybody else. He was brandishing a straight razor and talking about getting even with people. Others thought he was just kidding. He was going on to say that he could lick anybody his weight, 145 pounds. William Gill was one of the group, and Payne struck out at him with the open razor, missing when Gill jumped out of the way. Payne was talking continuously and going behind the bar. He grabbed John Beeman, the proprietor. He was still swinging the razor. Gill made sure to stay away from him. That is, until his face was sprayed with blood, and saw that John Beeman had his throat cut. He could not believe what he was seeing. He ran out of the saloon and never looked back. Others in the saloon that witnessed the murder of Beeman were George Lepper, Ed Tiffany, Thomas Drees, John Stauber, and Ernst Jeske. The story was told that Beeman and Payne were at the far end of the bar talking when Payne reached in his pocket, brought out the razor, and drew it quickly across Beeman's throat. Payne immediately ran from behind the bar and out the door north along Main Street. It seems that everyone else ran too, scattering in every direction. It was then that Beeman fell dead to the floor. He had been slashed from ear to ear, and the undertaker later explained that the razor was stopped by the spinal column. Otherwise, he would have been decapitated. A manhunt progressed all night, and the next day Payne was captured at Calvary Station by Sheriff Schaefer. This is John Beeman. Again, it's a drawing, but it's better than just the words. And this is William Payne. And as you can see, this was before his trial. So it says murderer on it. They wouldn't do that now. They did find him. They found him walking along the railroad tracks at Calvary Station. Anyway, they took him to the police station, and there was talk of lynching again. Payne and irons had been smuggled out the back to Elm Street, into a hack, to the train station, No one realized that he had been moved to Oshkosh. While at Oshkosh, Payne said to Sheriff Schaefer, "Shoot me. If the lynch mob gets a hold of me, I would rather die from a gunshot." On Tuesday, John Beeman was buried from St. Patrick's Church and his remains taken to Calvary Cemetery. He left a wife and 3 daughters. Payne pled not guilty to murder. No bail was allowed. He was sentenced to 25 years. He said it was better than life in prison. The Tingaloos have landed. It sounds like a bunch of little kids, but this was a group of young toughs who made residents of the 7th Ward near 5 Points very nervous. They hung out there, and ladies walking in the area were being insulted. Residents were afraid to complain to the police. Chief of Police Schaefer witnessed Casey Stanton come staggering up the street, and as he hung on a light pole, he began using indecent language, and a number of young ladies were being talked to. He was arrested. 3 more gang members were arrested that night and were charged and kept overnight in jail. The 3 others were Barney McDermott, Tucker Cahill, and Fred Gannon. Both Cahill and McDermott had to be restrained by a well-aimed right-hander to the jaw by the chief. While in jail, they attempted to escape by using an iron poker to break a hole through the floor. Gannon and Stanton got 10 days. McDermott and Cahill were freed, but their warning that they would have warrants sworn out against them for attempted escape. And the last one, Ed Morgan. He was shot in his side as a penalty for interfering too persistently with the family affairs of Peter Adams. They both lived on Elm Street. Seems, according to the neighbors, Ed had been seeing Mrs. Adams for at least 2 years. On Sunday evening, he called for Mrs. Adams and insisted that they go for a stroll. She said no. He persisted. She threatened to call a policeman. Ed decided to pound on her. Up to this time, Mr. Adams had not interfered. He didn't care. He was used to it. However, when Ed threw stones at the house, Adams got mad. That was different. That might damage something. Ed hit Mrs. Adams again, and she fired a revolver at him, but she missed. Mr. Adams went in the house, and he warned Ed if he didn't leave, he would get shot. He got shot. It is a serious wound and might prove fatal, according to this article. Adams was arrested on Sunday, and the charge was assault with intent to kill. On Monday, he paid $500 bail. The newspaper thought that from any standpoint, the circumstances show that none of the parties have a great halo of credit. So you have a touch of life, the way it was in Fond du Lac. I'm sure it hasn't changed too terribly much. It just isn't put in the newspapers the way it was. Seems to, oh, this is where that's where your little map is located. That is the area. Just so you know that it was northern part of Fond du Lac. And that's it. Thank you.